Seattle. I'm going to talk about policy research in an interdisciplinary world. I'm going to talk more about my current research projects tomorrow with the talk, so today is a bit more of a background on things. So, a bit about my background and then my stab at what is policy research, since that's one of the themes that we have going today. And then I'm going to spend a bit of time on the IAD Framework. Institutions will come up again. You'll see some of the same things that Abby started to talk about, so that's not a bad thing. I'll give you a brief example of common pool resources and forest research that's used this research. Then I'm going to spend most of my time looking at another model, which is the logic model framework. I'm going to be talking about my own research in environmental policy and collaborative watershed management, but I want to keep this logic model framework kind of front and center because I think it allows us to do some things interdisciplinarily, if I may. So, all right, a bit about my background. So, as I said earlier, my Ph.D. is in public policy, and that kind of came out of political science and also public administration, with a dash of economics thrown in there. That's not my background, but as you heard, Abby sort of came from that world as well. At Indiana University, this was called a joint degree in political science and the School of Public and Environmental Affairs, SPIA. I was advised by Elinor Ostrom, and she ran the workshop in political theory and policy analysis. I was a team member on interdisciplinary socio-ecological system projects back when the term wasn't even around yet in the 90s, projects related to forests in particular. And I would just say, thinking about my approach over the years, like Ostrom did, start with a problem or a puzzle, as she said. What's the puzzle? And then think through which fields of knowledge help us to answer that puzzle. So naturally, you're going to go toward the field that you know most about, but you should be also able to work with new fields and go seek new information, which Lynn was so very good at cultivating all around here. So thinking about the problem and then finding which fields or disciplines can help you answer that. Okay, so what is policy research? Policy research began as a field in the 1950s. Harold Lasswell is a name that comes up a lot if you Google policy sciences. There's a journal called Policy Sciences, and to this day, if you want to get published in the journal, you kind of have to cite Lasswell for something. I kid, but not very much. It's a specific discipline. And Shipman, and that idea was moving beyond political science, which then was called government, started studies of government, to connect policy and politics and administration. So I like to think of it as this way: study of government kind of stops once you have the law passed. We're done, ta-da! Maybe there'd be something about creating the EPA or creating some department, but there wasn't much else beyond that. So that was where public administration started. We have an agency trying to do something for the public good. Let's see how that managers do their work and how the laws affect them. So these were two different worlds, but policy research kind of combines those. So you can look at policy and politics and administration. Scholars who call their work public policy often examine sort of sequences of how policies are created, then how they're implemented, and then what results, if any, they achieve, and why or why not. So think of a series of steps, if you will. We all know that's not how it happens sequentially in steps, but we can think of it that way. These studies usually involve governmental actors as key players. Here I'm using the term actors the way that Lynn would use the term actors, which is a person who makes decisions about the world, makes choices in light of information and incentives and values and that sort of a thing. Not an actor like you'd see in Hollywood, but an actor as in somebody who acts. And policy research would traditionally focus on people who would say, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. I work in this agency, or I'm an elected official, or I'm a lobbyist. Like, that's the world that policy, public policy, was focused on. And policy research would include both basic and applied science. So you'd maybe start with a problem and figure out how can we reduce recidivism among inmates who get out, or how can we reduce children not having proper nutrition, or how can we clean up the environment. Could start with a problem and then think of policy solutions and how you get those enacted and how you get those implemented. Or it could be more basic science, understanding, well, what affects the shape that policies will take? Why does Washington's recycling policy look very different than Oregon's, even though they're both neighboring states with very progressive ideologies and similar kinds of environment? What accounts for that difference, and does that difference mean anything? So there could be theories about how things work differently. In my own PhD, I was working with a theory of federalism, which is what happens when the national level is in charge of something versus the state level is in charge of something. I happen to be studying forests. I studied Morgan's organization, the Forest Service, and also several state forest agencies to build theories of federalism. How do state state bureaucrats and federal bureaucrats differ in their behaviors? I just happened to pick forests. I could have picked transportation or any other kinds of policy. So there could be some basic questions about how policies are created and enacted and implemented. There's a lot of scholarship on implementation. So it could be basic or applied policy research. A leading book on public policy for graduate students is the edited volume called Theories of the Policy Process. It's in its 4th edition as of this summer. I just got a copy by Paul Sabatier and Chris Weibel. Weibel was Sabatier's student. Sabatier passed away a couple of years ago. He started this series many years ago, and his student Weibel has carried it on with him. But it's a very instructive sort of primer on theories of the policy process. They define public policy as deliberate decisions of a government or equivalent authority towards some specific objective. So it's kind of broad and general, but it's in the public realm. It's not like if I go to Target and try to return something without a receipt, they say, well, you get 3 of those per year. Let me see your license. That's their policy, right? We're not talking about private policy, but public policy. So government or equivalent authority towards specific objectives. They have 7 major theories they cover. I have a chapter for each, and they focus on different sets of variables with different assumptions and different hypotheses. So these 7 major theories appearing in the recent book is one's called multiple streams theory, how these multiple streams of politics and ideas and agendas converge to get a policy created. And that's mostly about how you get a policy created, not how it's then carried out. The second one is called punctuated equilibrium. The question there is about sometimes we see policy areas where there's not a lot of change over decades, and then something will happen and it will change. Others change very rapidly. How do we explain these policies changing or not? Then there's one called policy feedback theory. It's very dynamic. The one called advocacy coalition framework, which talks about different groups of actors and interest groups coming together and pushing through policies and having coalitions and so forth. Then there's something that Abby mentioned, narrative policy framework, thinking of narrative stories we tell as an explanation for why we get the policies that we do. There's one on innovation and diffusion. My example of Washington and Oregon's recycling policy would fit there, perhaps. I would use that as a theoretical frame. And then the one that I put in red, because I'm going to talk more about this, is the Institutional Analysis and Development Framework, IAD Framework. So all of these are different kinds of theories of the policy process that you would find in the book, and that's a decent rundown of what the field of policy sciences, policy research looks like. Okay, I will add also there's a recent trend up here. Remember I said it was government or equivalent authority? Well, the or equivalent authority now seems to be on the upswing. Focus more on non-governmental actors as key players in public policy, also known as governance. And some schools are calling themselves schools of governance. I think Abby's title had governance in her title as well. University of Washington Seattle recently renamed its policy school the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance. So this term links back to Ostrom's work on non-state actors managing collective goods, such as common pool resources. Her book, Governing the Commons, 1990, was governing. She's talking about governance. So she was not just talking about central state actors, right? The government. She was talking about users creating their own rules to govern themselves. So that's the sense that governing has kind of come back around of late. An important analytical tool for policy research, one of the ones in the 7 ones from that textbook, is called the IAD Framework. And the IAD Framework, like all theoretical frameworks, tries to organize inquiry. Where do we start to attack a problem? Where do we look? How do we know what we should be looking for? And the framework suggests some things to look for. So I'm going to put up a diagram and talk about the IAD Framework. So before we do that, a couple of things that Lynn was always keen on talking about clearly was this: when we're conceptualizing policy, or any problem, what we want to do is distinguish between heuristics, models, theories, and frameworks. And she said these are 4 very different things. Heuristic is just something that we use, like that chart over there, to kind of help us orient ourselves. In the example of the policy research, it would be the policy is in stages, and the first stage is getting it on the agenda. Someone's got to consider it. And then the second one is actually formulating the policy and mustering the votes to pass, stage 2. Stage 3 would be then implementing the policy. And then stage 4 is evaluating the policy. So these are 4 distinct steps that help undergraduates in their first political science course learn about this. It's not actually how things play out in the real world very often, but it is sort of chunks of how to kind of take this messy process and conceptualize it. And this is, by the way, very different than saying we're going to study government. So Unit 1 is Congress, and Unit 2 is the presidency, and Unit 3 is the administrative part, and Unit 4 may or may not be the press. Like, this is sort of how it's been done, and these different organizations work a lot among each other to help get the policy. So heuristics is an attempt to kind of put new bins on this messy process. Then she talked about models, theories, and frameworks. Models are where you put precise assumptions on your variables, and you say, well, if this variable is high, then this variable is going to be high or low. We'll have a model where this is what this variable is, and this other variable will interact them, and we'll see what the result is. So it's specifying, like an agent-based model would be an example, putting in assumptions. The theories is the kind of the heart and soul of all the work that I think we do, looking at causal links among variables. X causes Y. X1 and X2 cause Y. What is causing this thing to happen? It's a theory of something causing something else. And then the framework, so it'll involve variables. It might be demographic variables, it might be variables about communication, or the many variables all of us think about. And then frameworks help us organize inquiry. Frameworks help us think about classes of variables, types of variables we need to pay attention to understand a phenomena. And the diagram I'm going to show you, the IAD framework, is such a diagram. So IAD framework diagram has this center part, the action arena, which is over, so I can do this here, action arena in the middle. I color-coded it because a couple of slides I have information about each one of those boxes. So the action arena is actors, and they are in these things called action situations. So I'm going to talk about now this action arena. Oh, there it is right there. All right. So the thing about this framework is it is developed and used across many sectors. So when Morgan mentioned that Lynn had started looking at water and understanding water, people drawing out water, using the water, or collecting the water, and then trying to move it into the realm of forests. Well, forest, trees, and water are very different, right? You draw out water, you don't draw out trees, you chop down a tree or you plant. So you could also think about that herders, or you can think about people who get fish from the ocean. A lot of different types of resources have different specific details, and when you're harvesting or collecting it or chopping it down or netting it. And she said we need to have a common language so that we can look across these different specific studies and see if there's any generalizability from how this plays out in the world. So develop and use across many sectors. The emphasis on the action arena is actors are in positions to decide things. This is that kind of agency that Abby was talking about. And they decide things in light of their information about how their actions are going to lead to certain outcomes and whether they like those outcomes or not. So they have in their head ideas about what's going to happen if they choose A versus B, if they choose to cooperate or defect, and what that will do to the outcomes and how they feel about those outcomes. The actors have preferences about actions, and they have preferences about outcomes. They would prefer more wood to less wood. They'd prefer more security in their water rights than less security. They also have information processing abilities. This is where Lynn kind of went off with this Herbert Simon group of saying humans don't maximize like the economists think that they do or model as they do. Humans have imperfections in their ability to understand information, and that's part of this model. Actors have selection criteria they use. Do they want to maximize the minimum that they're going to get, or do they want to just optimize? Even if they're going to lose a lot, they could gain a lot. What's their thing that they care about in selecting actions? And then there are resources they have at their disposal. More or less resources helps affect their decision making. So we have some assumptions, partly from economics, about what's going on in the head of the actors. This was before they had those scans that show your brain lighting up, you know, the psychologists now do. So cognitive science is moving us along. This was back in the 80s. This was being developed, so it was the standard model, but it was tweaked. It wasn't just maximizing your gain. It was thinking about what else do I care about and how do I make trade-offs and that sort of thing. So these actors are in an action situation, which is any social space where individuals act and interact. So an example of foresters, she would say the forest itself is an action arena. People go into the forest to take things, and maybe they're taking things they shouldn't. Maybe there's been a rule about it. Maybe they're being sneaky, or they're going out at night, or maybe they're following the rules. What are they doing when they're in the forest? They're interacting with others. If you see someone collecting a tree that's too big, what do? Do you turn them in? Do you confront them? So this is things are happening in this action situation. But also the action situations involve the rule making about that forest. So if there's a community that owns this resource, the community may have gotten together and said, let's figure out what we need as a community to have the forest not be destroyed. So let's have a limit on you can only take one headload of fodder out every day, or you can only go in 1 day a week, or you can only use this kind of technology. So the situation where people are sitting down and crafting rules about management is itself an action situation. So you can have the action situation of planning and rule making, and then you have a situation actually out working with the resource. So that's the actors in the action arena. On the left side of the diagram, you have the physical world and the community and the rules, and all of these things have an effect on the actors when they're in the decision spaces making those decisions. So the physical world are things like the size of the resource, temporal and spatial variability. Are there parts of the resource that grow fast and some that don't? If you put somebody on one corner and say that's your corner, you stay there, if there's a lot of variability, that might harm them if there's a bad year. It might be better to have a larger area with people sharing that risk of the variability. The current conditions and also the growth rates of the resource. So here's where you have the natural sciences coming in, right? Things about the physical world we might want to measure and understand. And importantly here, it's what the actors in the situation know and understand about their physical world, that's what really matters in many senses. Community, this is the social context. This would be the common understanding about action arenas and how humans should relate to other humans. Maybe not specifically about trees, but for example, do you trust strangers or not, right? Do you defer to elders or not? What's the culture? She called that culture with air quotes. The homogeneity of preferences. Are people in this community of one mind in some general things they all agree on, or is it very diverse? I have a student doing research in India where the caste system really makes this very different. Also distribution of resources in the community. This is never called environmental justice, but it touches on who has the resources in the community, and that might affect people's decision making. And then finally, rules. This is like the key point. I'd put a star on it if I could. Statements about which actions are required or prohibited or permitted, and sanctions authorized for rule breaking. This is the institutions in the IAD framework, and she ended up studying a lot about rules. And a rule is something that says you are required to send a family member once a year for the planting we do on our trees, or to clip out the vines that are taking over. Well, what does that mean a day? Do you have to be there at the crack of dawn? What if you send a teenager? They're not going to do as much work. So they have to negotiate what that rule means, but there's rules about what's required. There are also rules about what's prohibited. In a forest setting, you would be prohibited from cutting a tree that was more than the size, or maybe there's a sacred grove that you're not allowed to go into. Anything that's, you can imagine with a resource could be prohibited. And then permitted is a rule that says you are allowed to do this thing. Yes, you're allowed to. You're not required to, but yes, we'll allow you to do that. So these are the three kinds of rules that can exist. And note, I've been using the forestry example, but you could have rules about fisheries. You could have the rules about irrigation systems, which was a lot of our studies. You could have rules about any kind of resource you might care about. And this was the new thing about this framework, is that it wasn't just talking about one resource. It wasn't talking to the fisheries management folks who did their own economic models of fish growth and allowable catches. It was also talking to people who did irrigation for agriculture, which usually those literatures never talk to each other. Now there's a common language to have this thing called institutions. Okay. Now we get to the right side of the diagram, which is sort of the end result, right? You have the actors in action situations and their patterns of interaction. Most of social reality includes multiple action arenas linked sequentially or simultaneously. So, for example, there might be a set of rules about going and taking trees out, and there might be another rule about going and planting trees in the spring. And these are related, but they're separate, and they might have separate rules and separate people involved, but they overlap and they occur simultaneously. So we try to extract one action arena at a time to focus on, but realize that other action arenas coexist as well. Outcomes are the results, and evaluative criteria are applied, and you could include the economic criteria of things like efficiency, but you could also look at the fairness, ecological resource conditions, and fostering learning over time. Is there adaptation going on, and so forth. And this diagram, there's a lot of pieces to it, and one study won't look at all these pieces most likely, but it will look at pieces and see how they connect up. One example I want to give you is one I mentioned earlier today, the book 1990 book Governing the Commons. A common pool resource is, like Garrett Hardin talked about, a resource where it was difficult to keep people out, so it's hard to exclude users from using it. And in addition, users who use it subtract from each other. The resource use diminishes the more you use it. Some resources aren't like that. An example I've seen used is military that protects a country. The fact that I live in a country with a military, my neighbor is no less protected. I haven't used up that military protection, right? A common pool resource, though, you would use it up. So there's intense competition, and there could be a problem with people overusing it. And that's what the tragedy of the commons is about. The tragedy of the commons actually picked an example, and Ostrom would call this a model. Let's model a situation where you have a bunch of herders in a resource, and the herders, they are not allowed to communicate with each other. And in addition, we're going to model this one time and see what they do. They're not worried about the shadow of the future, and they're just worried about now. So we're going to make this model with these variable values, no communication, a one-shot model, and the prediction is that then you will have a destruction of the commons. And theoretically and as a model, that makes perfect sense. Ostrom said, yeah, but look around the world, we see places where there are herders and they don't destroy the resource. What's going on? And what's going on was the reality is that that it's not the case that these herders don't communicate, and it's not the case that this is a one-shot game. Think about it. If you're living up in a remote mountain village and you've got 300 people in your village, you think you're going to interact with people more than once? You think it's going to matter if you cheat today? What's going to happen? Of course. You're going to be able to communicate and figure things out. So she said the tragedy of the commons is true if you model it the way that it was modeled by Garrett Hardin, you expect the result. But in reality, let's not rush to the conclusion that anytime we see a resource being shared, it's going to be destroyed. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of people were doing in the day. Lynn's book of 1990 was kind of an antidote to that, saying, you know what? It's only true that destruction is inevitable if these conditions are met in the model the way he modeled it, but in reality, that's sort of rare. So when she developed the book, she did a comparative case study method to build a theory of sustainable common pool resource management and use. So she looked for regularities, some that worked, some that didn't, and was able to distill down some basic ideas like, it's largely about the rules. They were able to make some rules themselves, and they had something in there about monitoring, because if you don't monitor, then once someone breaks the rule and benefits, then other people are going to see that, and it'll all unravel. So she focused on rules, and rules is a kind of institution that affects appropriators' incentives to make sustainable choices. This is a key variable set. So rules for Lynn were always central, but then she branched out from there. And this kind of makes sense from a political science perspective, as political science is largely about rules, right? Laws, what are the voting rules? What did the congressman pass? Who voted in the committee for this or that? What does the law say? How is it adjudicated by the courts? Bureaucrats, we know, follow rules. So yeah, it makes sense, it's rules. But Ostrom was talking more about rules that groups of users can make that's separate from the government that we say. The government made some rules. And by the way, this IAD framework could also be applied to Congress. What are the actors in Congress? What are their incentives? What's the community that they're trying to be faithful to? And then what rules affect when they can vote? So there's rules in that setting as well. But she was clearly saying, I'm not just talking about Congress or something like that. Yeah? We'll see. Okay. The other example I want to mention here before leaving this part is the IFRI research program, International Forestry Resources and Institutions. Yeah, International Forestry Resources and Institutions. There was a book in 2000 by Clark Gibson et al., People and Forests. So 1992, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization provided program funding to Ostrom to systematically gather and analyze data about governance arrangements for forest management around the world. This is, Morgan alluded to this big data set of systematically collecting the same things. So I was part of this team that was, as a PhD student, as much as you are, like learning the ropes and also doing it too, developing a set of core instruments for social and natural science data based on the IAD framework. So we would go into a community that had forest users. This was in Indiana. In our own backyard, we found, I think, 5 different forest communities where people, even though we think of the U.S. as being private property all the way, no, there were groups of communities who together owned land and cooperated. And she was very excited to find that in our backyard, because we always think of that as the Himalayas or India or somewhere far away in Africa, but it was right there. So we developed, the team developed a set of instruments to get measures on local rules, local institutions, the demographics, the socioeconomic characteristics, and then a lot of forest mensuration. This is the nested plots. We ended up with 1 meter, 3 meter, and 10 meter nested plots. And the 1 meter, you intensively sample the type of vegetative cover and get botanists there to help you. The 3 meter, you're including a bunch of saplings too, because you want to know the age structure. And the 10 meter, you're focusing on the bigger trees and you're identifying the species in the crown cover. So we had ecologists there on the project, as well as people talking to the locals, doing field research interviews on, well, how did the community get founded? Have you ever had any conflicts? What do you do when that occurs? Who decides what the rules are going to be? You know, all of that stuff. And this protocol was implemented in sites around the world, Bolivia, Ecuador, India, Nepal, Uganda, and so on. And these folks from around the world would come to Bloomington, Indiana, and spend a quarter or semester, I think it was, part of a semester, with this, taking it kind of as a training, as a class. I was a TA for that class a couple of times. And we would go out and field test the instruments and train these folks. They would go back to their home countries and they would do their own project using the same protocols, and then they would enter their data into the spreadsheets, and that would go up to a giant database, which still exists. There have been a few papers published on it linking rules to actual ecological outcomes, which is very rare to see. But when you have hundreds of forest plots and thousands of coding sheets, you can do some pretty big number crunching. This was back before big data was a thing, so I think this is sort of before the time. So that was the IFRI research program, again, based on that. So just to wrap up this section of the talk, IAD Framework is sort of a scaffolding that can hold different theories depending on the context. So just because I said the community is going to affect the actions of individual, I didn't tell you what theories of community and action I was thinking about, right? That's because it can hold different theories. The framework is kind of just pointing us to pay attention to those things as variable sets to look at. The analyst examines classes of variables thought to affect an action arena. Action arenas are complex, and they interact with other action arenas, so this can quickly become untenable if you want to do a thorough analysis of everything that affects the forest management. You're not going to do it, but maybe you can do a focal area that captures some of the most important stuff. And then rules have been a key focus, because that's the lever that policymakers often pull. So if I'm a policymaker and I want a better outcome, it might be hard to change the community, and it might be hard to change the physical world, like patterns of drought and rainfall, but maybe I can change the rules. So there's a potential leverage point there to make changes.
So Tom, just real quick on that. It's strange that you end with that conclusion about policymakers, where one of the things that you're emphasizing is that it could be a set of communities around a resource that have no policy.
Right. No, you're right. It's probably a better phrase to say that the actors themselves can pull. You're right. It doesn't have to be policymakers. Yep. Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to talk about another one, the logic model. Yeah, so this is basically a series of cause and effect. It can be used to link events in human and natural systems. We start over on the left-hand side with inputs. Human financial technical resources are inputs to a process, for example, a planning process, and that planning process will yield outputs. So an output is something that the process directly creates. It's a plan. We have a plan. And that's not the end of the story, right? Because just you have a plan doesn't mean anyone's going to do anything with the plan. The plan is used to guide decisions about things like projects. So we would call that the end output. And then after the project is done, well, maybe that project actually did or did not affect human behavior. Maybe we did an educational intervention to get people to stop littering. So we would go through the steps, and we would have a project, which was some billboard campaign, and then we'd wonder if we changed behavior or not, right? That's what we're wanting to get. But we're really not just trying to change human behavior. What we're trying to do is get a landscape that has less litter on it, right? So the end outcomes, this could be social or environmental outcomes, is what you're ultimately trying to get to, and you're trying to get to it through some process that is way upstream here, right? Inputs and a process that you go through. So there's a lot of stuff that can happen. This box down here is very important. In addition to whatever you do to fix the problem or change the outcome, there are a lot of other non-programmatic, non-intervention variables that can get in the way and cause you to have outcomes that are different than what you're hoping for. And so it might look like you utterly failed, when in fact maybe it would have been way worse if you hadn't done anything. So this is the challenge that people have been using for looking at how we can make a difference and fix things. And I should say this model came out of university extension offices. I think Wisconsin was the place I've seen it cited first. Your home stomping grounds, Abby. Do you guys know what a land-grant university is in the United States? Who's from a land-grant university? Okay, so yeah, it has a mission. Its funding is coming from, with the mission to extend knowledge out to the public. So you have extension agents who work in universities. Where I was at Ohio State University, I had one down the hall who worked on water programs for the state of Ohio. And he told me that they use this model as well. But for me, it's more a way to step through and break down something complex. And try to think about what policies are going to be useful or not useful. Getting back to what I said, policy research includes how to solve problems. So I want to talk now about environmental policy and how this links back to the logic model, and just a little bit of background about the environmental policy in the United States. I love this picture. This is the Cuyahoga River in Ohio. It's on fire. Why is the river burning? There's so much pollution from oil slicks and other materials that the river would routinely catch on fire. When I went to find a picture to show my students, I found there were lots of pictures over many, many years. I'm like, do you want the 1951 version or the 1963 version? So I picked this version because, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a firefighter up there with a hose spraying water on the fire on the water. So it's like, yeah, no, that's not going to do it. So this was the state of the environment before 1970 in the U.S. It was very polluted. Think of China today, right? This is the U.S. scene. Much. Put it out quick. Much of the so has anybody here seen a U.S. river catch on fire in your lifetime? No, they no longer catch on fire. Yay, pat ourselves on the back. We're doing much, much better. Much pollution cleanup in the U.S. has happened since 1970, so I want to say that we've made great strides in air and water, so yay, right? This came about from federal level command and control statutes. Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, National Forest Management Act, etc. All in the early 1970s. Public opinion and protest movements swayed legislatures till they had no choice but to pass this legislation if they didn't want to lose election. And the ones who didn't got voted out. It was quite stunning. Environmental movement was at the apex of its power. Never since has it been that powerful. We'll see if it'll ever again be that powerful, but that got us all these wonderful, cumbersome, large command and control laws. Statutes targeted big actors, and they gave citizens new powers to litigate, right? If the agency that's supposed to monitor doesn't catch everyone, that's okay, because citizens can bring lawsuits. The law says even if you weren't personally harmed, you can have standing in the court to sue. So environmental interest groups took up the mantle of this and did a lot of litigation. So the early 70s, a lot of things changed. Today, unfortunately, we're not making such progress because now most of our pollution is not from the big smokestack from one power plant. It's not mostly from a big pipe going into the river. It's from diffuse sources. All the runoff from all the acres of the city, agricultural fields, automobile exhaust. There are thousands, maybe billions of decision makers all doing little things that makes it polluted. So that's really hard to monitor, right? You can't use command and control very well because you don't know who to point the blame at, and it would cost a lot of money to go after everyone, and each one that you got would be just a small reduction. So we're in a new landscape of how in the world do we keep going with environmental cleanup. So to address these complex problems with these many, many polluters, the government as a command and control actor has been overlaid by this thing called collaborative governance, and that's what I study. I've been studying that for the last almost 20 years. Collaborative governance, collaborative management, whatever you call it. Abby mentioned a few projects as well, you know, resource management with collaborative things. That's where diverse stakeholders from government as well as non-government cooperate across boundaries to solve problems together. This exists in lots of areas: education and policing, social services, public health is doing a lot of this lately, and of course environment, which is what I want to talk to you about today. So collaborative governance for Watershed in particular, which is what I've done the most research on, where you have citizens and interest groups and government personnel work together to create a plan. They have a watershed action plan, a watershed management plan, an ecosystem restoration plan. They're making a plan, right? Talking, agreeing, getting maps, getting information, seeing what would work, and together they have a plan. This is growing across the US and around the world. Millions of dollars there's a law, the Clean Water Act I mentioned. Section 319 was added after the original law. It's mostly about wetlands, but it also includes a mechanism for money to go to states to distribute to clean up waterways. And millions of those dollars have been used to clean up, collaboratively clean up watersheds across the US. So real money is being put in these things. In addition, some states have taken up initiatives to get collaborative governance for their watersheds. An example that I know most is Ohio. Ohio has this thing called the Watershed Coordinated Grants Program. Those are 3-year grants to local groups, and the money will be used to hire a watershed coordinator who will coordinate the creation of a plan. The state also provides technical assistance to information that you might need to be smart about what the plan is, the sources of pollution, how to identify the polluters, what that's going to do on the landscape, and ideas for how to solve these problems. The grantees develop a collaborative watershed plan. The goal is to combine scientific and local knowledge, get local buy-in, and to build networks and social capital to carry out actions. And social capital is interrelations among people who want to work together and help each other rather than be enemies. Social capital can be built by collaboration. And this is citizens and governments working together. So again, this is in the realm of governance. It's not just the government is going to make a clean air or clean water law and then fine the polluters. It's people working together. The users, the community members are going to work together. Okay. The $1 million question, as I say, maybe it should be $1 billion now, is how can we best achieve desired environmental conditions? How can we achieve clean water? That's what we want. And in 1970, using the Clean Water Act was a great way to do it. Today, we still need it, but that's not enough. We need other ways to take care of that. So I'm going to bring you back to this logic model and ask this question: how can we best achieve desired environmental conditions? And this example is thinking about Lake Erie, which is that part of Ohio that's Ohio actually calls itself a coastal state, and it gets funding. There's some coastal management funding from the federal level because they have a coast. It's just Lake Erie, but they care a lot about cleaning that up. So how can we achieve cleanup of Lake Erie, knowing that it's not just big polluters with smoke, with pipes that we can easily shut down? So going back to this model, we would start with the end outcomes, which is environmental conditions. What are the water quality conditions in Lake Erie? So what are the trends in these conditions? Is it getting better or worse? What are reliable indicators of environmental conditions? These are all questions that natural scientists have been working on and are continuing to work on. How bad is it? How good is it? What are the trends? How can we measure it without spending millions of dollars to measure all the chemistry in there? What are some indicators? Maybe it's macroinvertebrates. Maybe it's the health of fish, top-level predators. Whatever it is, we need to figure out how to measure that environmental condition of clean water. Another question for natural scientists Okay, what about riparian buffer strips? We know that stormwater runoff is the cause of some of the pollution. Let's put in riparian buffer strips where we plant trees instead of asphalt or bare ground. You know, what should we plant there? What vegetation and what density and how close? If we want to meet desired water quality, how are these projects, how are these different kinds of projects, in this case riparian buffer strip projects, how can we best manage those and build those to help with our environmental conditions? Again, still in the natural science world, right? All right. A couple more natural science. How does fertilizer use impact water quality? What is the impact of stormwater runoff, temperature, zebra mussels, etc. on water quality? So we may have a program about riparian buffers, but we need to be aware that there are these other variables as well that are outside of our program that also are going to impact water quality. So far these are all natural science questions. Causal links between something causing something else. Now we get into the social science world. There's a link from end outputs to intermediate outcomes, that is from the projects to the actual human behavior. Here the human behavior might be fertilizer use, right? We want farmers to use less fertilizer, or I don't know, more toxic fertilizer, or maybe fertilizer certain months but not others. So how do we get the humans to do things differently? This is social science. Maybe tax incentives or educational campaigns would affect fertilizer use. Buffer strips would also affect fertilizer getting to the waterway, but different ways to deal with environmental outcomes. And this would be the question of how to get humans to use fertilizer differently. So what if we want to build a plan that can then affect the projects we do? Why did we decide that we're going to spend money on an educational campaign rather than something else? Maybe some groups got together, and this would be the things that I study, collaborative groups getting together, talking about possible solutions. Maybe we need to tax the fertilizer or just get the word out or do something else. What factors affect the plan and how we're going to carry that plan out? So again, this is a social science question. And another example of working backwards on this model is, okay, this plan exists to guide our behavior and our suggestions. How do collaborative planning efforts affect management plans? Who do you invite to the table? Is it an evening meeting or a night meeting? Do you provide daycare? Do you provide snacks? Do you have a professional facilitator? Is it consensus-based? Is it unanimity? All the different things about how you can manage and run a group and who's invited are questions that have been studied in my field for a long time. Lots of studies about the process of collaboration. But we need to then say, how does that affect the outputs? Okay? So we can put this all together and trace from beginning to the end. And as I'm doing my work on collaborative management for environmental things, and you'll hear more about this tomorrow in my talk about how science is used in these things, how we can think about breaking up the pieces of this very complex puzzle and working on bits of it at a time. And we have ways to put these together in different research designs. I just want to mention a few possibilities there. So we could go with experimental methods, quasi-experimental methods, big N statistics, or case studies. These are sort of main ones that have been done. Well, the first one not done very often. So let's talk a little bit about each of those. Experimental methods, the gold standard is randomized trials, right? We're going to assign this process to this watershed and this process to that watershed. We've randomly assigned it, so there's nothing innate in the context that's going to affect the results. It's going to be our random assignment, and if we get results and compare them and we do enough of this, we can say something like, okay, good. Experimentally, we've shown this type of collaboration leads to this kind of outcome. That would be great. Problem is, it's hard to do, and it's very difficult to go get actors in the world to follow your random assignment. I have a friend in Germany who got money for a project to do this. He was going to go to local managers who were forced to do some sort of public involvement by this new law, and they could choose whatever one they wanted. So he went around and asked people, could we randomly assign which type of public involvement? He was literally going to roll the dice, like that was going to be his randomizer. And then turned out people didn't want to do that. So nobody agreed, so they didn't do the study. They did a quasi-experiment instead. So experimental would be great. We've done it once in a collaborative process in Ohio, but we didn't have enough volunteers to come to have enough power to say anything. But it can be done. In theory, you could do it, but it hasn't been done much. Primarily, feasibility is low. Long time horizon for environmental change is another problem. Even if you could assign the different things, when do you come back? Today? In a week? In a month? In a year? Maybe in 10 years it'll be better. Yay, it worked, but that's 10 years. By then, funding cycles have come and gone, tenure has come and gone, or whatever's happened. So it's hard to do this on landscape level things. Quasi-experimental method. You could also focus on collaboration as the process and see what you get with that, but without randomized controls or other features of classic experiments. So it's more feasible to do. It's pretty easy to find natural experiments, actually. Different process across the border. Indiana did it this way. Ohio did it this way. It's easy to find them, but it's harder to find these matched cases where you can really control for a lot of things and say, well, I think the reason was this one big difference. That was the reason. Well, there's also 10 other reasons or 100 other reasons. And also, it's hard to find valid longitudinal data. So as you all know, if you do any work with ecological systems and many human systems, things need to take time to unfold. So for us to actually see what caused what, it's going to take a long time. And longitudinal data is often sparse. Ecological monitoring data always seems to be the first data to get not funded. All this money in the Ohio program and others, none of it went to monitoring. The state government doesn't want to spend money on monitoring to see if they messed up or if they worked. The state wants to use money to pay farmers to put in riparian buffer strips because they know buffer strips work. So look, we planted 20 miles of buffer strips. Yay, give us more money. As opposed to saying, we're going to spend money to monitor and see if the buffer strips actually work well or not. That's usually not in the cards. Another method would be large and statistical methods to analyze correlations among variables, right? Large and statistical methods can compare and find correlations, and then we can infer cause and effect, usually through a theory. We could test probability of causal effects, although maybe not the causal mechanisms that led to those effects. It's high for existing data sets, and maybe SESYNC, I don't know, maybe SESYNC has access to some of these, or the people in SESYNC have great data sets that this could be done on. I'd be very curious to see if there were data on collaborative efforts and then what the results are years later if that's been collected. The longitudinal data is still a problem to find to match that up, which is what you'd really want. That's why the IFRI study I mentioned, a global study of forests around the world, they specifically went and got similar data, and they went back every couple of years. So that database exists. The University of Michigan, I believe, is currently housing it, and they've got lots of data. So that's kind of what I'm talking about here. It's a big endeavor, but it can be useful. And then finally, the one that most of us fall back on and use, and sometimes it's the best method, and sometimes it's just the only one that we could do, case study methods. This often emphasizes process tracing in causal sequence, searching for causal mechanisms, not just the causal effect, but what caused what. A led to B, B led to C, C led to D, kind of like that logic modeling that I showed you. So the chain of causality here. It's highly feasible to do because you pick a case and you go in and you study it, but it does require careful use of counterfactuals, congruence with theory, and controlled comparisons, trying to hold other variables constant, but of course there's lots of differences that are built into that. So last thing I'll just throw up here, but I'm not going to really talk about it in any detail, is that most recently I did a study between Ohio and Germany and looking at two different processes for developing collaborative watershed plans, one by state of Lower Saxony in Germany and one by the state of Ohio. We compared similar types of groups who had similar types of process. And the focus on that was on implementation of the plans and also creation of the plans. So we interviewed a lot of people. Mostly my work is through interviews. We looked at documents. We looked at plans. I don't do German, but I had German colleagues who read the plans for me. And we counted things and saw what was in the plans. And we interviewed people about making the plans. And then we also interviewed people about what the plans were able to produce. And we asked them, well, where was the list of recommendations? And of those recommendations, how many have been done and how many haven't been done, and why is that? So if we take the logic model as a whole, moving from the inputs all the way to the outcomes, we were able to work on these boxes, which is somewhat satisfying because it's a big chunk of this model, but it's not the end. So again, for my line of work, does collaborative watershed management improve the environment? That question is a tough nut to crack because of the long time frames and the lack of data. So in this study, I had to make do with just saying, you know what, I'm going to take this slice of the whole puzzle and use that. Okay. So we've talked about a little bit about what I think policy research is, the IAD framework, and then that logic model of stepping through to combine natural and social sciences. And I see that I'm right at 45 minutes, so yay. Right on schedule, so we have plenty of time for questions. So I'd be happy to take any questions.
Why don't we take questions for Tom, and if people also want to circle back to Abby, they should feel free to do so.
Yes.
So this is all super interesting, thank you. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately is this sort of flow between rules and actual practices and outcomes. And you talked a lot about the rules piece and the outcomes piece. You talked about the sort of the actors in the middle that would be supposedly doing something. But I'm curious, like if you work at all at sort of isolating, are the rules actually resulting, are different rules resulting in different practices that are then resulting in different outcomes?
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
that main piece in there also.
Yeah. I haven't done a lot of that myself, but that is a big part of the IAD framework. Yes, a lot of the studies using rules. There'll be a lot of studies about the kinds of rules that are created and then how those affect the actions that people do. So that is a big part of that link between not only what the rules are. So there's a lot of attention paid to how the rules get the way they are, right? Like how do they decide on these rules? But then a lot of it, I think most of it, would be given this set of rules in this context with these actors, what actions do they do? And then a part of the rules is then following up with the monitoring of the rules. One of the big takeaways from all of this research on common pool resources and rules, one of the big takeaways, other than the fact that users can sometimes be successful, not always, but they can, don't rule them out, is that they gotta have monitoring and sanctions. If you don't have monitoring and sanctions, it all falls apart. Think about driving on the road and the speed limit is 55, because it's hardly ever monitored and sanctioned if you're doing 5 miles above. If you're doing 20 miles above, it's sanctioned, right? So everybody creeps. Yeah, depends, right? I've been in Montana and it's kind of smooth sailing, but yeah, so monitoring sanctions are hugely important as follow-up to the rules that we've all agreed on the rules. Okay, now we're going to go out into the world and do our things, and if you guys are breaking the rules, you know what? We're going to make sure that you know that we know, and you're going to have sanctions. And there's ways for users to see other users breaking the rules and incentivize them for taking the effort to go and report them. Maybe it's talking to them directly or telling the group. Because if you have rules that go unfollowed, then they cease to be useful as rules.
And then is there work that then takes that and looks at differential outcomes as a result of those? So I can see what you're talking about in terms of the sanctions affecting following the rules.
Right. Yeah.
Users.
Yeah.
And is that also then
The study I mentioned of the ecological link back up, it's Eric Coleman and someone else wrote this a while back now of the IFRI database. And one of their main findings was if you had rules that were monitored and followed, then the trees had a bigger DBH and there's more biodiversity of the trees. So that was one of the few studies I can remember because it's so rare, it stands out, that these rules and the monitoring and sanctions then were linked statistically through a large N study to having forests that were, quote, better condition as defined by the size of the trees and the diversity of the trees there. So yeah.
So this hit really close to home for me, so glad you came. I don't work in Ohio, most of my work's here in the Bay, but it seems like there's a lot of watershed plans and a lot of 319 money that goes out. Is any of your work, and this may be too nuts and bolts, but is any of your work showed, is there a strategic way to use that money so it's useful?
Well, one of the ways in Ohio that I worked with, I didn't work with him, but a guy I knew who was the program manager for the state, we would chat about this all the time, and he would complain. He would say the federal EPA from Chicago is one of the regional that gives money for stuff. They are very reluctant to give us money for this Watershed Coordinator Grants program. And he said, I think we're sure that it's making a difference on the ground, but it takes a while. And I said, well, how come they don't want to give you the money? And he said, well, you can't count it. He said, the thing that we're doing is now we have a structure for coordinators to call together stakeholders. They're meeting, they're interacting, and they're figuring out how to do stuff and move forward together. Yeah, they create a plan, but that's maybe not the most important thing. And in my work in Germany, I found the exact same thing. These groups came together for 3 or 4 years, created a plan. The plan was supposed to feed up into a state of Lower Saxony water basin management plan, and it utterly failed at that step. They had 28 different groups, each submitted a 200-page document, way too much information. The state didn't know what to do with it, so they had a 3-page, they summarized it into 3 pages. And the 3 pages said, here are a list of kinds of activities that we think will help the water. Fence streams from cattle, remove low-head dams, don't plow up to the edge, plant riparian buffers. They had just generic stuff, and all the local groups were like, what the hell? We spent 3 years with all of our details, and now you're giving us this. But that's the end of the story. They reported that even though the plan didn't do anything for them, the practice of sitting down, talking, listening to others gave them connections with people. So they met at these quarterly meetings, and then when something came up, the city said, oh, we can get this grant if we can find 3 landowners to do this project. The person would say, oh, I know the farmers, let me call them up. He'd call up the farmers, they're like, yeah, we'll do this. So they had all these side benefits that happened from the act of collaborating together. So money, I think, is well spent on coordinators and getting people together and talking and working towards a plan, even if that plan then doesn't get carried out. But if there's networks built and relationships built, that seems to be the crux of it, and that's really hard to sell EPA on, right? Look, we built these friendships and relationships. We can't point to 3 miles of buffer strip, but that money seems to be, at least in the Ohio case and the Germany case, I would say a great investment.
Is there a way to quantify that? That may be the question too.
In Ohio, they wanted to justify the money they were getting, the $1 million a year, so they started making watershed coordinators fill out annual reports, and the reports asked a lot of questions like, did you use this to leverage other grants? And that was one big measure. It's kind of ironic, right? Used our money to get more money, yay, well, money is an input, right? But no, to them it was like an important thing. But also, did you develop new connections? And then they'll say, how many events did you do? We went to these 3 schools, and we had a watershed day and that kind of thing. So yeah, you can document the activities, but if you go back to that chart there, you're kind of documenting the end outputs, right? Like, again, this is the readily available end outputs. Did people change their behavior? Did the end outcomes? That's a really We had another study in Ohio where we had 2 similar counties, one with a watershed collaborative group and one without, and we wanted to measure the farmers' use of best management practices. We had a list of 13 different best management practices for the area, and we asked them, which of these do you do, how much? And the group that was the collaborative group did not use them any more than the group in the non-collaborative group. So the results were like, oh, in that case, did it make a difference? We went to a conference and presented that, and someone in the audience said, cool, you're the first ones to show that collaboration doesn't work. And I'm like, is that what we showed? I don't know, that doesn't seem right. I went back to the data, and then we looked, and we had people who were participated and went to the collaborative group, and also people in the county who didn't go to the group, and our survey was to people in the county, and the subset who were in the group, they showed a difference in their activities and behaviors. So looking at the data more carefully, we were able to conclude, and this was a paper in Society of Natural Resources, it's a pretty good journal, we're able to conclude that collaboration isn't always needed everywhere, and you shouldn't just always throw collaboration on a problem, because the county that didn't have collaboration, they had farmers who had less diverse cropping and more traditional relationships with the USDA program personnel who funneled money to them to do stuff. They didn't need a collaborative group because they had good relationships with the government, and they only had like 1 or 2 kinds of crops. This other county, when you match counties, you're always going to have differences. A difference which happened was that this one had smaller farms, diverse cropping and livestock mixed in, and they had less of a good relationship with their government personnel. So in that case, collaboration absolutely helped. So, I mean, does collaboration help? It depends, right? But what does it depend on? And so we're working on like, what is it? It depends on certain things. But number one, don't assume collaboration is always needed, because it's expensive and time consuming, and sometimes it's great, sometimes not. But number 2, a big takeaway that I've gotten from all of this is that collaboration isn't setting government aside. There was this big argument that government, as usual, doesn't work to clean up non-point source pollution, so instead of government, let's go over here and do this collaboration. That's what we need. It turns out that the government is still there in the background with the laws that are very important. If you were to take those away, collaboration would be less likely to work, because sometimes people collaborate to avoid the strong law from the 1970s. So you're layering on top. You've got there's a strong role for government, even as you have government. Even these government groups, the groups in Ohio that didn't have a presence of government agency folks, tended to get less done. the citizen back porch kind of 7 neighbors talk to their neighbors. That's all great for democracy and all, but they can't get stuff done because they lack the technical expertise and they don't have the resources to keep it going. It's the groups where the government is a heavy player that really get things done and make things work. So this points to the idea that we're not getting rid of government. As much as some used to argue that collaboration was the antidote to government, it's not at all. You got to have government there as well as the collaborative groups to get some things done, is what I would say. Morgan?
I wonder if you could comment on, you gave a list of, I think it was 6 or 7 different kinds of policy
Oh, the theories?
theories.
Uh-huh.
And the IAD feels extremely different from the other ones in that it's not, focus is not on government per
Yep,
se.
yep, yep.
And that it seems much more in tune with understanding socio-ecological systems, in particular at a
Yep.
at a more grounded level.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yep.
whether it's the protection of wetlands in Connecticut or it's farming communities in Mongolia. I mean, it just feels different.
Yep.
and
I agree.
if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I think the first 6, they're all converging on the idea of the government is doing something. It's the government's show, they're running the show, and how do they run the show, and what makes them do this or that? You know, all these theories about public policy. IAD wasn't built that way. It was kind of saying, no, government's not always running the show. What can local communities do? That said, I think it's come up to be useful for these questions of government-based policy, but bringing in this dose of the governance as well. So I think this one is a bit different than all the other ones. It wasn't born out of the assumption that the government is the center of the show. I think it was on the side, but yet as it's been used over time, has made connections to the government as part of this world in the IAD framework that you're looking at. But yeah, it's not starting with the assumption that it's all about government. And I think these other ones are different in that way, and they really do center it on the policy. So I think IAD was brought in as a way to look at policy, but it wasn't built specifically just to look at government stuff. Other questions?
I'll just add an observation then, which is that what you're starting to see increasingly is people who are focusing, whether they realize they're within the IAD framework or not, that the focus on studying stewardship groups
Mm-hmm.
and stewardship networks.
Mm-hmm.
Not all stewardship networks are collaborative networks,
Mm-hmm.
but
Okay.
this idea that stewardship groups complement but are not a substitute for government, and that stewardship groups can improve the social and the ecological fit
Mm-hmm.
of various types of policies and practices
Mm-hmm.
that the government cannot do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's becoming less of a, well, I don't know if there's becoming less of an argument of either or,
Mm-hmm.
and let's just say that there's more attention to the complementarity of,
Mm-hmm.
that I think the IAD also can help structure the way to look at it.
Mm-hmm.
That becomes really interesting. And I think that what's also very interesting is it's not just less developed rural areas,
Mm-hmm.
right? That wherever you go, you start to see this. It's sort of heavy with saying wherever you go, you see institutions.
Mm-hmm.
But wherever you go, you also see this complementarity between government and
Mm-hmm.
various types of local actors that are not government.
Mm-hmm.
That I think trying to understand that and compare
Mm-hmm.
becomes a huge research agenda.
Mhm.
Well, on a practical agenda.
Mhm.
Understand how is it working? Particularly as the things that we're dealing with are fragmented landscapes and a lot of non-point source issues
Right.
that are related to sustainability. Not just water, but a lot of
Mhm.
things that people may want.
Yeah, we have a book I co-wrote with 5 other authors, Collaborative Environmental Management, What Roles for Government. It was a Resource for the Future Press book that was all about that. It's like, look, up until 2004, we've seen a lot of scholars saying collaboration is better than government, so don't do government, do collaboration. We looked at 5 or 6 different cases of, one was farmland preservation, I think. There's endangered species, a couple of watershed ones, and we're making that very point, is that you have this combined kind of interaction of these two. And we divided up, one of our writers was, I don't know if she used to ride the bus a lot, but she's like, is the government driving the bus, or is the government just riding the bus? Or is the government like following along after the bus is already going somewhere? Like, yeah, like is it leading or following, or is it just kind of encouraging it? That's an interesting way to think about. The government is always there, so let's not pretend it's not, but it's not destructive all the time. The government can be very constructive for some of these efforts that require resources, and time is everyone's scarcest resource. You can't just have a volunteer group and just assume they'll all volunteer and do it, right? They're not. Volunteers have other priorities in their lives. If you hire a coordinator whose job is to do this, then perhaps you'll get someone who does all the mundane stuff that we all have to do when we're working as a group leader. You know, the emails, and don't put it off too long, and the phone calls, and I remember a snack for the meeting, get the room, you know, and checking in, and then following up with people. All those things that a coordinator does that help the group keep running smoothly. If you don't have that, it's pretty easy for the group to have one initial burst of excitement, and then everyone just goes about their business, right? So getting back to your question about like, how can we invest in resources, I would be less likely to talk about what kind of riparian buffer strips, and more about like building these conditions for humans to figure out that they want to work together, and by forcing them to work, incentivizing them to work together, they have enough in common that whatever happens in their one plan, maybe when another crisis pops up in 2 years, they'll know who to call. Or as I said, in Germany, I had lots of examples where people interact with folks that they never would have met with before, and now they do know a farmer who's pro-environment. Shocking, right? Like, you know, like, oh, we can work with this guy. And they got stuff done aside from the direct path of this plan led to. So even though my logic model sort of suggests that we'll have a straight path going from the outputs, end outputs over to the outcomes EA. Sometimes the paper we wrote for this this study of the implementation, I added a couple of extra boxes up here. I took the liberty of saying, I'm going to do some theory building, and like side projects, interaction, trust building, that led to better outcomes. So I sort of, that's what I do with theory. I don't ever see theory as a capital T, the theory of blah, blah, blah. Theory to me is just variables and their interactions, and we have studies over time that suggest these variables in this context tend to have this interaction. So then I'll see if I can add another box to it, or go inside the box and like look at inside the box. So it's not a grand theory in terms of like theory of evolution for me. It's always just saying we've got some generalizability from several studies showing that this amount of trust tends to lead to this amount of people working together. So let me see if it also works in the context of this. And then we can see if that theoretical reasoning, if you will, maybe not theory with a capital T, if that applies to new places, and where it breaks down, it doesn't apply, then you're like, well, why not? What do we need to add to our story to explain why the thing that works in these cases in the East Coast don't work in Arizona? Oh, maybe it's the water law. Okay, what is it about the prior appropriation, or whatever it is in your new setting that seems to not fit? You can see what boxes you need to add on the chart. Anything else?
Now, you propose that, say, collaborative management without monitoring sanctions will, I'm going to be a little bit extreme, will always fail. Now, do you call that a theory? Does it have a name? Or is it just our understanding of the systems? How do you position that?
Yeah, so collaborative management, a lot of collaborative management, your example is not, it's sticking with me because a lot of collaborative management
Focus on the sanctions,
isn't about,
monitoring
yeah.
the sanctions.
Thinking about like if there's a forest being managed and you don't have sanctions, yeah. So that would be, I would say the IAD framework informs that, but this would be part of theory of collective action or community action or whatever you want to call it. So yeah, I would say it's more about our understanding, and I would always write in my journal articles, prior literature shows a connection between this variable and this two variables under this kind of a circumstances. So this has been repeated in several places, so I want to see if it applies here, and I test it out and say it also applies here. First time we've seen it applied in a less developed country or something like that. So yeah, I don't ever capitalize theory, but I talk about our understanding of the system and how these variables interact. To me, that's how I approach thinking about theory. And then it's not so daunting, right? Who am I, a little old human being, to add to this tome of great knowledge that's theory, right? I'm not Darwin, theory of evolution. I don't have to be that guy. I can just see if their prior understanding of how variables are connected to each other and see if I can add to our understanding in that way. So theory building then becomes a lot easier to think about.
process, like a collaborative process to like manage a watershed led to a worse, not better outcome. And I'm thinking about the water framework directive in Europe, like in some of the countries, depending on how they transpose that law.
Yeah.
You know, like everybody was involved, but at the end, most of these non-state actors, they had their independent agenda, like they were not, collaborating to a better ecological state or anything. They were just like farmers who wanted to farm more, etc.
Yep.
So, like, I mean, what are the conditions that make that happen?
Yes, so there's a book I'm thinking of by Judith Laser. It's called Natural Experiments. I think it's around 2008 or something. She ended up being pretty pessimistic about collaboration. She had 7 or 8 cases where collaborative processes were used to manage landscapes, and a couple of them were watersheds, and there were a couple of them were other things. But in her conclusion, she argues that collaborative management leads to worse outcomes, because she says that when you have people all agreeing on something, what they can agree on is the most minimal thing, right? It's the lowest common denominator, she calls it. So if you require consensus, then you're going to water down, so to speak, the solution to where it's not that effective, but no one's really against it, so that's what you do. And so she argues that it's much better to have a strong government regulator come in and force people to behave. And so that's pretty different than all the other literature on collaborative management, but that's her. And I don't remember if she was talking about consensus, unanimity rules or not. That may be a big reason why. A lot of these collaborative groups don't require 100% agreement, so now you can imagine having plans that are not just down here low, but if you require everyone to agree, that maybe will make it low. So she was arguing from her cases that actually it usually is bad. So that's one that kind of stands out. Yeah. Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about how this model, so the context in which, like, you have human input, so the context within which this process plays out, you know, there's all kinds of histories and power dynamics that really color each situation and shape the different, so it's not like the community comes together and everyone's kind of equal. But can you talk about maybe how through this process, maybe it always doesn't need to be about the initial outcomes that were envisioned, but how, there's friendships that are made, but aside from having someone to call if you need something, there's maybe a different understanding of the types of how it addresses kind of what comes before this, the histories that this process is embedded in, and maybe different visions of kind of what community means. I mean, I'm getting a little too loose here, but
no, I gotcha. And in fact, the box here, this box here, this was where, when we started with collaborative watershed management studies in the 90s, this is where everybody was, right here. It was basically like, look, there's this new thing called collaborative something. Let's go see what it looks like. Let's go look at who's involved. What are there's a lot of studies about the process. No one is thinking about the outcomes. They would start out by saying, oh, you know, the existing policy doesn't get us to where we want to go, so therefore, let's do this. This must be good because the existing one is bad. So it was illogical, but that's how it was framed. People were really boosters and supporters of this, and a lot of early studies were just describing what was going on. It was very much context specific because in a way it always is, but there was case study after case study after case study, and there was no work at theorizing, generalizing, and so forth. And in 2001, Leach and Pelkey wrote a journal article about, we've looked at all 31 cases of collaborative watershed management studies, and we've concluded that they draw 215 lessons. So the complaint was that there's just way too much to get our arms around, and we need to pay more attention to being careful about how we conceptualize variables and move forward and so forth. There's a lot of stuff going on here, and because of that, we have a lot of examples of, like you said, good things and bad things happening. Regarding coming together and finding a common vision, is it Judith Innes? I think Judith Innes and Boer, they're both out in California. They do some practitioner and academic work combined. They convene groups. They have a book, Planning with Complexity, I think it's called, from 2010 maybe. And that book, they talk a lot about what goes on inside that black box of the collaborative table. So if you guys were the collaborators and you came together, they have a book all about, like, you know, what time of day, do you feed them? If yes, you feed them. Provide daycare, encourage them to come. Once you're there, you have a whiteboard, keep a running list of agreements, like they're all about that, and they have lots of examples, yes, where they say at the end of the process, people report feeling like now they have a common vision and understanding. So that's very common. When I did research in Germany and I did questionnaires with people in these different groups, one of the questions was about learning. What did you learn in the process? Did you learn about the ecology of the place? Did you learn about how government grants work? Now you can get government grants. Did you learn about what other stakeholders wanted? And that was a pretty decent showing of people said, yeah, I did improve my learning about what other stakeholders around the table want. Because you have to understand what other people want before you can get together somewhere and move in a good direction. So I think it's pretty clear a lot of studies of collaboration would actually focus mostly on this box, and I bet a lot of them would talk about people having a better understanding. And sometimes that better understanding is that I can't work with you. I didn't know you were so far off the rails for me, so go away, I don't want to work with you. That happens too. There are a couple of case studies that's published that talk about the bad side of collaboration. But I think most of the things I've seen about collaboration and the description of them talk about this part where the groups get together and in the end they feel like they've learned and maybe changed their vision somewhat. So yeah, people have studied that. And I think the Innocent Boer book I mentioned, they would say it has a lot to do with how you run the meeting. If you run it, if you facilitate it properly, you can get there closer than if you don't know what you're doing and you can make it worse. Yeah. Thank you.
So sorry I missed your presentation, but I was wondering, I don't know if you covered it for us already, but I was struck by the ending conversation on sort of the government versus collaboration.
Yeah.
Suppose a tension, and I was wondering if you found theories around social capital useful in terms of conceptualizing the vertical versus horizontal, relationships, reciprocity, trust.
Social capital, it often comes up, but I've never really delved into that in any deep way. But certainly social capital is one of the things that you would look at as an end outcome. An end outcome is a social outcome. In fact, since ecological outcomes are so hard to measure, a lot of people just, if they do bother to study the outcomes, will focus on the social outcomes, which of course are important. And their social capital ideas are often in there. Trust is a big one. There's lots of studies have mentioned trust and whether trust is important on the front end, right? These people interacting, how much do they trust each other? And then through the process, as at the end, is their trust better or worse? So as one part of social capital. But I do think most studies of collaborative management end up that talk about the process, most often describe some process where people get to know each other better, learn about each other, and build a little bit of trust and a bit of network. That's a pretty common finding.
I guess to push a little bit on what Billy was talking about, so where you see, it's particularly true in rural community forestry, where men had the rights to the main stems of the trees, and women had rights to the branches and the leaves, and that was related to who was responsible for gathering firewood, and the leaves were used for feeding livestock, but the real money was in the stem of the tree, and you had very different views and power relationships.
Yes.
As to how the forests were managed. And so that was gender driven and it was also affected by age and things. In these logic models, thinking about collaborative management or common pool resources, thinking about how do you pay attention to those power relationships by gender and by age.
Yep. As Abby alluded to, that's the sort of community box under the IAD framework that says the rules, the physical world, and the community all will have some baseline impact on the actors. And as Abby said, that's not been a real strength of people who have used the IAD, have not delved much into that. In the collaborative watershed management literature, which I should say is largely devoid of IAD, other than Abby, I don't know if anyone is studying collaborative management, I don't know if the IAD would come up. I doubt it. I think it's a pretty separate. Yeah, there's but not much. But in the collaborative watershed management, there's not a whole lot written about power, although I've seen a few about power, and the takeaway seems to be that when people come in with a lack of power, don't expect that they're all of a sudden going to be all on the same level playing field. I do know there are examples where, actually with the Forest Service in Oregon, they said, we're going to have a planning collaborative group to give us advice and things, but remember, by law, we can't allow the group to make the choice. We're the ones who are the agency. The law says we have to decide where to cut the trees. So be aware, folks, we cannot actually make us all equal power. And collaborative management, in one sense, is supposed to make everybody at the table equal power. So it's you can't do both. So there are power imbalances, certainly. Some groups may not be invited, right? There's studies on who's there and who gets invited and who doesn't, and how that affects the outcome. And then once they're there, are they empowered to actually speak and their mind, or are they intimidated because outside of that they don't have power? So the facilitator role is somewhat helpful there, but again, it can't cure that. You know, I have a student doing work on the caste system in India, and they were able to cultivate a group where the Daleks, which are like the, which one is it? Is it higher or lower? Help me out here, do you know? Low, yeah. So they were the low caste, and in the group, they all eventually got to the point where they sat together and ate, which was a big deal. But once they were outside of the meeting, the castes, you know. So when they're in the meeting, it was unclear whether they were able to speak their mind when they knew that outside of the meeting, they would be in this unequal position. So yes, I think power is understudied in the field in which I'm immersed of these collaborative watershed management things. And I think in the IAD framework, sometimes there, but it's not really maybe newer.
But it's an area that's definitely like Arun Agarwal,
Hmm.
who is the one that has, well, whatever, he obviously works, or he works on some of those issues. Krister Anderson has been working
Okay.
on some of the leaf issues. We've been trying to do like the leaf capture issues. But yeah, I mean, this is an area I think that we can bring in outside theory. So this is where in my own work I've been working with EJ scholars to try to think about power and how that affects the process.
Mhm.
It's understudied for sure.
Yeah, I think so.
So, thank you very much. Cindy and I are sharing knowing Loic said it is beer 30.
All right.
It is 2 minutes.
Beer 30.
Uh-oh.